Sarah Malik is a quietly resilient woman whose life has been shaped by small, steady acts of care. Teaching, tending a cluttered garden, balancing bills with a calculator that has seen better days. On a routine flight to attend a friend's wedding, she is publicly denied an upgrade to first class and humiliated by an entitled passenger. Unbeknownst to her, her husband Omar, reclusive, brilliant, and the secret owner of the airline, watches from the shadows, wrestling with the ethics of his hidden power and the distance that has grown between them. As the flight becomes a crucible for dignity, compassion, and truth, Sarah's natural grace reveals the cruelty and grace in others, forcing both her and Omar to confront what wealth cannot buy: trust, redemption, and the choice to be seen. The tone is cinematic and intimate, exploring themes of class, humility, agency, and the human cost of secrecy. They called it Flight 712 to Marrakech, though the destination felt less important to Sarah than the small rituals she carried with her. She always arrived at airports early for the solitude, an hour in which the world condensed to suitcases, coffee steam, and the low, patient hum of fluorescent lights. Today, she stood with a worn leather tote on her shoulder, a paperback in hand, the spine softened by repeated readings, and a boarding pass she had printed at home because the hotel printer had jammed the last time. She tried to be spontaneous. The check-in line smelled of cheap perfume and burnt toast. Beyond the glass, jets crouched like white beasts, their bellies polished and waiting. Sarah thumbed her phone for the 100th time, not for messages. She didn't expect many, but for the little comfort of checking the weather. Warm, mild, a promise of sun. She breathed out, letting the airport's rhythm settle her, the lilt of announcements, the clatter of baggage wheels, the susurrus of business people rehearsing phone pitches. To most, she thought, it was just traveling. To her, it was gathering pieces of life into a neat rectangle. Clothes, notes for a workshop she taught, a photograph of her father tucked into her wallet. Malik. A woman's voice snapped Sarah's attention to the podium where a line of passengers consolidated into the first-class lane. The gate agent, a woman with hair pulled into an immaculate knot, a name tag that read Martai, lifted a hand. Her smile was practiced, efficient. "We have a complimentary upgrade available. Would you like to take it?" For a heartbeat, the world rearranged itself into possibility. First class had always been something Sarah had admired from a distance: the velvet barrier, the plush seats, the way people in first class seemed to move as if they belonged to a different time. One with fewer compromises. She shook her head, reflexively, and it surprised her how little that felt like a regret. "No, thank you," she said instead. "Someone else should." "Actually," Marta interrupted, scrolling. "It's for a loyalty tier passenger. I can offer it to you for a small fee." The fee she quoted hovered like an insult. Sarah felt the soft, hot prick behind her eyes. Not anger, not yet, but the fog of being measured in a currency she didn't keep. She smiled, thin and quick. "I'm fine where I am, thanks." From the corner of her eye, she saw the woman in line ahead, Elise Parrish, blouse white as fresh linen, heels that could have served as weapons, who turned and made a face, an expression that was equal parts disdain and calculation. Elise flicked her wrist as if brushing off an imaginary speck and said, loud enough for a few people to hear, "Honestly, so many people act like they belong everywhere. No wonder the airlines are chaotic. Some of you should know your place." The sentence landed like a slap. Sarah looked at her own hands. Veins like small rivers, cuticles bitten during late night grading, and then down the aisle where a child with a mango-streaked face clutched a stuffed rabbit. Around them, some people shifted uneasily, others, like Elise's companion, laughed, low and smug. Sarah could feel her cheeks warming. Small humiliations accumulate like grit. Left unattended, they scratch at dignity. A man behind Sarah, inexpensive casual, said nothing. His silence felt like endorsement. Marta's smile didn't waver. "Mom, please," she said to Elise with the practiced evenness of someone who'd managed thousands of small storms. "We need to close the lane." "Of Ms. Parrish is such a frequent flyer," Elise said sweetly, eyes sharp as a blade. "She wouldn't be standing here. Am I right? Should I let the offer go to someone who actually travels this airline? Do you want to?" "That's enough." A voice heavy with authority cut through the hum. People looked up. A man in a dark overcoat stood close to the desk. A body the color of late coffee, hair iron, gray at the temples. He wore anonymity like an overcoat, expensive but unremarked. Up close, his eyes were the color of iron filings, patient and blunt. "Ladies, let's not make a scene." Sarah didn't know the man, but something about his timbre steadied the air. Elise's smile didn't waver long. She swept past like a cat, flanked by two people with identically blank expressions, and took the first-class lane anyway, as if her presence had been preordained. Sarah watched Elise go. A cheap, ridiculous anger rose, less at the woman than at the choreography of privilege that unfolded without apologies. She had, in her life, seen doors open for people who smelled of status and close for others who carried careworn bags. Once, at a parent-teacher meeting, an affluent father had smirked at her curriculum suggestions. He'd said, "We have higher standards at our school." The memory stung. She could still hear the children reciting their timetables. She remembered, too, the years when she had sat across from Omar, before the title, before the wealth, listening to his plans for an airline he insisted would be kinder, cleaner restrooms, humane boarding, quiet cabins for people who needed to sleep. At the time, his eyes shone with schematics and aluminum. Now, the man at the counter watched Elise's retreating back and then glanced at Sarah, as if counting something he didn't yet understand. "Are you okay?" Marta asked softly. Her hands were folded, the way someone folds hands when they want to be useful but aren't sure how. Sarah laughed, a small sound that didn't touch her eyes. "Yes, I'm fine. Thank you." It was nothing. Marta's gaze on her lingered. "What can still?" She started, then swallowed. "Never mind. Boarding begins at 12:30. People moved through security like a current changing its bed. Sarah slid her paperback into her tote and breathed the stale comfort of a travel mug she'd bought in October. When the boarding call came, it was the man in the dark overcoat who once more stepped forward. He scanned his pass, then turned and offered his elbow. "After you," he said. They walked together along the jet bridge. The sunlight through the windows caught the dust motes like gold coins. "I'm Omar," he said, as if names were the bridge. "Omar Khalid." She offered, "Sarah Malik." Her voice found the inflection of civility. His handshake was brief and warm. There was a familiarity in it that had nothing to do with his name. "You've been traveling a lot?" he asked. His words were conversational, but there was the faint weight of observation behind them. "Little," she admitted. "Workshop in Marrakech. A friend is getting married." "You?" "Something to do with the plane," he said, and didn't specify. He seemed content to let things float there, the truth lightly tethered. They boarded together, making their way past the first-class curtains. Sarah's seat was in the economy cabin, a cluster by the wing, practical and familiar. She had always liked economy in some perverse way. It held a kind of democracy she respected. People were closer, you overheard the human comedy in small bites. She placed her bag in the overhead and settled into the seat, an island of cotton, blend fabric. The cabin hummed with the small rituals of flight. Zippers, the rattle of plastic bags, someone consoling a fretful child. Sarah studied the map on the seat back screen. The wrote a slim arc across cobalt water, and thought once more of Omar's measured presence. He had sat in the aisle seat across from them, reading the in-flight magazine with an attention that suggested he read for density, not for pleasure. At one point he looked up, caught her eye, and offered a small, private smile that carried no explanation. Boarding completed, The plane taxied into a belly-deep roar and took the sky like a thought. Below, the city retreated, a spatter of buildings and lights. Inside the cabin, people adjusted themselves into the fragile constellations of travel. Elise, unmistakably, sashayed down the aisle to the front, where her seat waited, a small throne of embroidered leather. Sarah could see the curl of her mouth as a steward, mid-30s, with a name tag that said GOAH, flipped through a tablet and then bowed with the practiced deference airlines train their crews to offer VIPs. Then, the plane hit a patch of turbulence, an unexpected lurch that sent a wave through the passengers. A stroller toppled, a baby let out a squeal. Sarah clutched the armrests, the air in the cabin thick with a startled hush. The map on her screen stalled like a heartbeat. An older woman 2 rows ahead, linen shawl slung like a shawl of memory, muttered something about my medication and began patting the small handbag on her knees. The child with the stuffed rabbit nearby began to cry. Elise's coterie looked around with irritation, their eyebrows measures of moral outrage without responsibility. "Is anyone hurt?" Jonah called, voice steady, then moved down the aisle with a practiced speed. He knelt beside the older woman, checking her pulse, asking quiet questions. When he reached Sarah, he gave a small nod, the sort of ear-to-ear verdict that passes between people who are paid to fix small crises. He had a face like a lighthouse, dependable, blunted edges softened by the creases of laughter. Sarah found herself unexpectedly helping, holding the older woman's hand, smoothing the child's tearful cheek, offering the hem of her sleeve as an impromptu napkin. It felt normal to do so. Her hands had always been useful in small, exacting tasks, threading the same needle, tying a knot in someone's shoelace, stirring a pot until something simple made sense. The experience of helping someone ground her, a little film of panic smoothing into workable lines. After the turbulence passed, a steward moved through the aisles with water and sachets of damp coolness. Sarah sipped her water slowly, letting the cold trace the inside of her mouth. She glanced back toward the front and saw Omar stand, making his way forward. He didn't look like a man who owned a sky full of planes. He looked like someone who had stepped into the wrong story. When he passed her row, his hand brushed hers. "Stay," he said with a gentleness that sounded like a plea, then went on. The sound of his voice carried no authority, only something like longing. She caught the memory of their first apartment, tiny, cluttered with blueprints and contraband dreams. When Omar had argued vehemently that the shape of an aisle could change a life. "If you design the path," he'd said then, "people walk differently." She had laughed, then, at the naive romanticism that would become the architecture of airlines, of terminals, of boardrooms. Somewhere in the widening vertigo of success, that early joy had been fenced off and labeled business. During the flight, Sarah listened more than she spoke. A woman across the aisle tried to soothe a boy with a fever. A man 2 rows back clicked through spreadsheets with an intensity that made the plane feel like a mobile office. Omar moved through the cabin with a kind of soft observation, his eyes catching things other eyes might not. The crookedness of a tie, the pattern of a child's breath, the wear on the armrest by the window. He asked Jonah about the crew's morale, about a policy she'd once heard him mention. Change the boarding so elderly passengers board in groups, he had said, to reduce anxiety. Jonah answered with the ease of someone who spoke the language of planes but not of profit. They exchanged small, factual things that tethered the corporation to the human. At one point, the captain announced a delay on the tarmac in Marrakech, an issue with equipment. Applause, rare in a plane, shortened into a murmur. People sighed. Elise's lips compressed into a thin line of displeasure. "I have somewhere to be," she said loudly enough that people turned. "I expect to be treated with priority." "Please," Marta said, intervening from the front like a referee. "We're doing our best. We'll update everyone when we know more." The delay stretched. Hours dilate inside a plane. Minutes seep like water into cloth. Food began to make its slow rounds. Sarah ate a small salad, the vinaigrette sharp and comforting. She thought of the wedding dress waiting in her suitcase, of vows that often sounded like contracts until someone whispered the promise again. In the time of waiting, the plane condensed into a microcosm of the world Elise, entitled and brittle, a young couple whispering about a house with more light than they needed. Two elderly men discussing cricket and age, as if they were interchangeable topics. And then, a little like a sudden rain, a minor crisis, the child with the rabbit, Nia, grew faint and listless, her skin turning translucent in the cabin's artificial light. Her mother, young, thin, and visibly exhausted, whispered a plea to the flight staff. Jonah moved immediately. He had the professional calm of someone who had seen the small deaths of panic before. He checked Nia's pulse and then looked up. "We need to land," he said, voice flat with the authority of the practical. No one shouted. There was only the slow, collective holding of breath. Elise hissed, "This is a delay I did not budget my life for." Her words were small and cruel, but in the next instant Omar stood. He didn't reach for a microphone, he didn't make a spectacle. Instead, he went to the mother and the child, knelt with the same ease Jonah reserved for the ill, and murmured something beneath his breath. Sarah watched him from her seat. He didn't act like a man wielding power. He acted like someone who had practiced empathy until it became reflex. He offered his scarf to Nia's mother to cool the child's forehead. "Is she allergic to anything?" he asked. The mother shook her head, and Omar's hand was steady on the child's wrist. "Hold her legs up slightly. Cool compresses at the temple, please." He gave instructions not like a leader barking orders, but like a neighbor who knew a thing that mattered. The crew, wagon, wheel coordinated, descended into action. The captain signaled control on the radio. They would make an unscheduled landing at an airport 2 hours closer. There was a specialist facility there. The crew explained over the intercom with crisp professional care. "Save yourself if you must," people thought, but in the minute that followed, there was a framing of a different kind of priority: who needs help first. The plane descended like a thought into ocean, silver light. On the ground, lit by the sterile flood of the alternate airport, Nia was moved into the hands of paramedics who handled her with the ease of practice. Omar stayed until the ambulance doors closed, until the mother clutched Nia's hand and pressed her cheek to the child's brow. Only then did he return to the plane. He washed his face in the cramped airplane lavatory, pressing both palms into the cool porcelain like someone trying to steady a body that felt suddenly too large. When he emerged, Sarah was waiting by the lavatory door. She had walked out to breathe the thin, plain air. He looked at her then, and for the first time in a long while there was something in his gaze that resembled apology. "Are you all right?" he asked. Then, faster. "I didn't recognize you at the counter." You didn't?" she said, completing the sentence not as accusation but as fact. "You didn't need to." He leaned his forehead against the cool metal of the cabin wall. "I sometimes like to travel anonymously," he said. "It helps me understand the product without filters." "You own the product," Sarah said. The words were simple, pointed. She spoke them without rancor. She didn't raise her voice. Around them, voices blinked like a stadium of small fires. He looked at her then with an expression folding into something like sorrow. "I know." He said it like a confession. "I own this airline." For a second she laughed. A brief flaring sound like a match struck and quenched. "Of course you do," she said. The laugh was not cruel. It was astonished, the way one laughs at a coincidence that is heavy with meaning. All the gestures of their shared past rearranged themselves, the blueprints, the nights of cheap pizza and high talk, the gradual accretion of meetings and cufflinks. He had told her he wanted to change the sky, but he had not told her how it would change him. "I didn't tell you because I wanted you to be yourself," Omar said. He reached for her hand, then paused, the gesture uncertain. "And because it became complicated, and because I thought that maybe if you saw what I had built you would leave." Sarah looked at his hand, and then at her own, which held a coffee cup ring at the rim from the beverage she'd set aside in the waiting. "Leave you for what?" she asked. "For making money. For having more chairs in first class. For how I changed," he said. "For how we changed. For the fact that I measure life in projections now." She studied him. There were lines near his eyes she hadn't seen before, small etchings left by stress and decisions. Up close, he looked both smaller and more worn than she had expected wealth to render someone. The overcoat didn't disguise the tremor in his hands. "You chose secrecy," she said. "You chose to be absent from our small things. I thought you were traveling for work. I thought you were." She didn't finish. The unsaid hung between them like a script neither wanted to read aloud. Omar closed his eyes. "I thought I was protecting you," he whispered. "I thought distance could keep you safe from the mess." Her thoughts turned, not to anger, but to history, the nights when Omar had sketched terminals that smelled of jasmine, his stubborn insistence on dignity in boarding, his small acts, insisting on proper crew rest, paying for a nurse to be in the crew base, quiet investments in cleaner restrooms. She had been proud then, proud of a man who wanted to make travel kinder. Somewhere along the climb, his protectiveness had become a literal distance. He had hoarded the truth as if it were a jewel that might shatter if touched. "Did you come back to test me?" she asked, an old hurt braiding itself into the question. He drew in air, then let it out slowly. "No tests. I came to see how the airline handled itself when everything unspooled. I came to see how the staff would behave when things weren't tidy." He kept his voice flat, but shame warmed it at the edges like heat under paper. "And mostly, I suppose, I came because I missed you." His admission was not theatrical. It was small and human, a confession that he had been cowardly, and that his power didn't exempt him from regret. Sarah looked at him and saw a man whose power had been sharpened into a kind of armor. She also saw a man who could still be surprised by the world. "You missed me," she echoed. "You missed the life we had when we were two people in a sketch of a home. How did that life become a thing you were afraid to share?" He shrugged. "Fear is a quiet thing," he said. "It sits in the margins. At first, it was about the safety of your family. Money brings attention. Then, as lines were drawn on spreadsheets, fear became habit." She thought of their first apartment again, a place with a window that leaked light in a way that made everything look possible. Her memories polished it into a thing they both could share. But in reality, their lives had diverged on small decisions, a job that demanded presence versus a job that demanded secrecy. She placed her hand on his wrist. The skin felt warm and real, not exoticized by wealth. "There's a difference," she said quietly, "between protecting someone and deciding for them." He nodded. "I know." They didn't resolve everything in the narrow space of the airplane lavatory. Reconciliations are rarely swift. They are stitched slowly by care and time. But the conversation opened an avenue, a kind of raw honesty that was new. When the captain announced they would be able to continue to Marrakech after medical checks, Omar sat back down nearby, not in first class, but simply where he had been. One of the faces in the economy aisle. He didn't take back the towels he'd given, nor the instructions he'd offered. He had simply been there. Present, flawed, human. At landing, handshakes passed and farewells were murmured. Elise's collar was scuffed with indignation. She left the plane with the efficiency of someone who has plans that do not tolerate delay. Marta, who had watched the original exchange at the gate, caught Sarah's eye on the jet bridge and gave a small nod, an acknowledgement that something meaningful had been noticed. Outside the terminal, The light was the color of bent coins. Omar hailed a cab like any other passenger, the way a man who owns an airline might still be able to descend into ordinary gestures. They walked through the airport together, not as show, but as two people who had found themselves momentarily untangled. On the drive to the hotel, Omar reached for Sarah's hand and asked, softly, "Tell me how your workshop went. Tell me about the bride." She spoke easily then, her voice threading stories into the shrinking lights. She described the bride's laugh, the way she wore jasmine in her hair, the way the city's markets smelled of cedar and orange. Omar listened, sometimes interrupting with a question. A true question, not a demand. He did not promise to change the world in 10 bullet points. He promised instead to try, to let her into decisions that mattered. It was a modest promise, but in its modesty it carried a heft. Wealth, he knew, could buy many things. It could not buy the quiet craving to be counted, to be part of the decision that shaped both of their lives. In the days that followed, they navigated the delicate geography of reconnection. Omar introduced small shifts at work, new programs for crew welfare, transparent channels for employee feedback. He did not announce himself from louder platforms. He worked in small, quiet ways that pulled inconsistent behavior into steady policies. Sarah, for her part, refused any special treatment. She accepted no preferential boarding, no VIP pass that would make her into someone else. Her dignity, she had learned, rested not in a velvet seat, but in the refusal to barter her sense of self for convenience. The press, when it noticed it all, framed it as a feel-good story. Billionaire shows humility, couple reconciles. But the truth of it was quieter. Omar withheld no more secrets without discussion. He let Sarah see the balances and the bad margins. And Sarah, in her own quiet way, taught him how to measure life in acts that didn't show up on balance sheets, the way crew members fared on 2 consecutive transits, the way a gate agent held herself when insult arrived like water through a sieve, the small dignity of serving a warm coffee with genuine attention. One evening, months later, Omar took Sarah to a part of the airline's hangar he had once sketched in coffee-stained napkins. It was no marble palace, rather, a space lined with windows that let in light like permission. He had arranged, quietly, for a ceremony for the people who rarely got applause. The gate crews, the mechanics, the stewards who had held the cabin's fragility when planes felt like fragile trophies. He stood behind a small podium and looked at Sarah as if she were the only face in a crowd that mattered. "This woman," he said, "teaches me more than any report. She made me remember that dignity matters." His voice didn't tremble. It steadied as if he had given it a shape. "Oh, my apology is public," he continued. "And my work will be too." Sarah walked up to him, and in a place where applause rose like a wave and faded into faces, she took his hand. She didn't expect perfection. Nobody does. She wanted partnership, not rescue. There are stories that hinge on the moment of revelation. The billionaire revealed, the crowd gasps, the world tilts. But the revelation that mattered. Outside an airport terminal, beneath fluorescent lights and the hush of a plane, was subtle and human. It was not the disclosure of wealth that changed things, but the way that disclosure was followed by action. Omar's confession did not erase the small humiliations of life, but it offered a promise to be seen and to see. Back home, Sarah returned to her workshop and her garden. She continued to iron shirts for students who couldn't afford dry cleaning, to bind the same notebooks with care, to give lectures with the same soft intensity that had always left the room fuller. She did not become ostentatious. The first-class seat remained, mostly, a thing she watched other people occupy. But she found in herself a new yardstick for dignity. The way people treated each other when no cameras were on, when no airline press release circulated. Omar learned how to weigh decisions, not just in profit, but in the small economies of care that made the world livable. They rebuilt a life not with dramatic gestures but with countless small ones, the kind that add up over the years: a text during a long shift, a package of jasmine tea left in a coat pocket, a voicemail that began with an apology and ended with a laugh. In the spaces between ambition and humility, they discovered a kind of truce with living: that power might make the world wider, but tenderness made it meaningful. On another flight months later, Sarah boarded and, without fanfare, without entitlement, accepted her economy seat. As the plane taxied and rose into a sky that seemed to be stitched by invisible hands, she leaned back and watched shadows pass over fields. At the window, Omar folded his hands on his lap, content simply to be beside her. They did not need to sit in first class to be present in each other's lives. They had learned, in the narrow, hermetic world of an airplane, that dignity is not assigned by a seat location, but by the choices we make while we sit.